Okay, my name is Ezra Mabengeza. I'm from South Africa, half Bedi, half Xhosa, and I'm playing Patrice Lumumba, another member of the Nguni clan.
Excellent. So the class that we're actually interviewing you for is Africa in the West, and so there's this perception of Africa in the media, largely, that the representation is that it's doomed and that there's only one story coming out of Africa, and it's poverty and it's AIDS and it's violence and civil unrest. Yeah. So our question for you is, why do you think Africa is portrayed in this way?
Well, I mean, some of those facts are, realistic. I mean, that is what is going on. But I think, obviously, there's a couple of things. Number one, the idea of continuing to portray that image, there's a benefit to that. I know that there's certain individuals, powers, corporations, organizations that want to continue portraying that image because they want to continue to exploit the resources. Generally human nature, if you're seeing something not seen in a positive way, you just tend to I don't really want to watch it, so you don't really want to kind of investigate that. The general thing is, every time you see Africa or whatever, it's like, no, I don't really want to think about it, I want to go to a party right now. You know what I mean? So they know. I mean, they've done studies on psychology and all these types of things. That how do you continue to create a negative image? The second thing is I think that's not an excuse anymore. I think a lot of us sitting here, if we were to ask each other our cultural backgrounds, it would just be unbelievable. You know what I mean? Like, this generation now has no excuse to say, oh, that's a negative image, I can't be bothered with it. It's like, listen, man, the information is there. You must have a desire somehow to inquire, because one of us knows someone who's African or half African or, Thai, you know what I mean? It's just, the list is endless. So you can't make that excuse anymore.
How did you come to theater? What inspired you to become an actor?
I mean, I've been doing theater my whole life. I am, my family is very artistic. On my father's side, you have the Miriam Makebas, the Makeb Davashes, that's all on my father's side of the family. So music and art and performance is on my father's side, whereas on my mother's side, they're academics, and they're very sort of intense. So it's a nice balance, and I grew up doing theater, in school, and my parents never missed a single one of my plays. I was also, a really good athlete, but they never actually ever watched me play sport. They were always like, man, the art is your thing, So it just kind of, I guess it was destiny. Yeah.
What are some of the unique or same emotional complexities you've experienced in previous performances that kind of prepared you for this role of Patrice Lumumba?
Definitely, you sort of, character development is a big thing, understanding the literature, knowing, who you're portraying, what's the context of it. That's all part of years of training and being involved in plays, and that's the sort of, let's say, the academic side of what you do, and then there's the spiritual side of what you do, and that's kind of growing up, under apartheid, knowing what it is to be oppressed, growing up under a colonial system, and how, that's impacted the lives of so many. And then you have an individual, who's asking you the same questions, that I was asking when I was younger. I remember, having conversations with my father and saying, man, when I'm 19, believe me, this country's going to be liberated. just sort of defining what that means. You know, does sort of, you know, being granted independence mean, okay, cool, we've got a party? Or does it mean like, okay, this is when the real work begins because we're so far behind? These are all the same questions, you know, I had, you know, once we were given, you know, our freedom. So when I'm reading the text brilliantly written by Ami Cesar, it's like, I mean, these are exactly the same things that we were saying as part of our revolution. So, and then, you know, that's a portion of the spirituality. And then there's the deeper basis of the sort of spirituality that comes with that role, you know, is understanding the person's culture, you know, understanding, you know, the non-tribalism that he was, you know, up for.
Somebody that doesn't know that much about who Patrice Lumumba was, can you kind of describe him?
Definitely, I would say a very, like, number one, he's a handsome guy. You know, you look at his photos, you're like, man, this guy's dapper, you know. He had a great sense of humor, you know. He was very passionate, without a doubt. He believed in what he was doing. You know, one of the things that struck me early on when I was reading the text is this notion that he had, you know, for me it's, you know, I use the word notion, but actually this truth that Africa won't fail. You know, Africa, what he means, as far as I'm concerned, is humanity. You know, that's the cradle of humanity. So ultimately, humanity's not going to fail. You know, it's a very, very large part of what drove him to do what he needed to do, you know. And it's so well written by Cesar that it's almost sort of biblical in a way, you know what I mean? And that this person was so noble that he was prepared to stick to the truth. And he didn't even consider his own life. He just said, look, this is the truth. I mean, it should be plain to everybody. Biblical in a way, you know what I mean? And that this person was so noble that he was prepared to stick to the truth. And he didn't even consider his own life. He was a very sincere person, very dedicated. You know, once they got into power, you know, he apparently had no time off. You know, he was, you know, in the play he says, you know, we've got 6 months, you know, we've got like 60 years worth of backlog, you know, and some of you, now that we are in power, are, you know, relaxing, deciding not to come to the cabinet meetings, and, you know, and he's like, I don't understand that, you know. You've been crawling around when you were under Belgian, you know, lordship. You know, now that you're your own masters, you feel like you need to take a break. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, on the one hand, you know, you do sympathize because it's like, man, it's relentless, you know. But you have to understand that it's one thing to be tired because you're slaving. It's a whole nother thing to be tired because you're working for your own independence and freedom. You know, that's actually, you're gaining energy. That's what it's been in my experience. You know, here I am sitting in New York, and I'm doing what I want to do, and I'm doing it off the back of my parents' labor, and it's joy. It was all joy that I experienced, you know, and that's what they imparted onto me. When you work for your own independence and your own sovereignty, firstly as an individual and then outwardly, you gain power. You're not exhausted. So those are some of the things that you definitely see in Patrice, you know, and you have to just love him for that and embrace him for that.